My family didn't just take my grandfather's farm. They took 5 years of my life, and they smiled while doing it. I still remember the exact sound the gavel made when the judge brought it down. I remember the way it echoed in that quiet courtroom in Owen Sound, how the silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had ever carried. The word guilty had already been spoken, but the gavel made it final. My mother bowed her head. My father sat perfectly still. My brother, the one who had grown up sharing a bedroom wall with me, reached over and placed his hand on my father's arm, as though he was the one who needed steadying. Not one of them looked at me. My name is Blythe Carver. I grew up in a farmhouse in Grey County, Ontario, about 2 hours north of Toronto. My grandfather Douglas had built that property into something real over 60 years. He started with nothing but a 180-acre parcel of land his own father had left him, and he spent his entire life expanding it, adding timber rights, leasing portions to neighboring farmers, and eventually holding an estate worth close to $4 million. Everyone in the family knew the farm would pass down one day. My parents and my brother spent years assuming that day would be a windfall. My grandfather had other ideas. During the last year of his life, when his health started slipping and the paperwork on his desk began to pile up, he asked me specifically to help him put things in order. Not my father, not my brother, me. I was 27 at the time, working as a bookkeeper for a small construction company in Barrie. He said I had his head for numbers and his patience for detail. I thought he was just being kind. I had no idea that those months spent sitting beside him at the kitchen table, going through binders and cross-checking ledger entries, would later become the reason an entire courtroom decided I was a criminal. He passed away in late October quietly in his own bed. The funeral was held on a cold gray Saturday, and after the reception, when the neighbors had gone home and the casserole dishes had been stacked in the back of someone's car, his estate lawyer arranged a meeting. It was during that meeting that we learned nearly $800,000 in timber rights and a 30-acre parcel of farmland had been transferred out of the estate before my grandfather's death. The paperwork bore my signature. I had never signed anything. 2 mornings after that meeting, I was standing in my apartment making coffee when someone knocked on the door. There were 2 officers. They were polite, but their questions were not. They wanted to know about the transfers. They wanted to know about the bank accounts. They asked if I recognized a numbered corporation registered in my name, a name I had never heard before. I kept telling them I didn't understand what they were describing. They kept writing things down. When the detectives executed their search warrant 3 days later, they found documents in a cardboard box stored in my storage locker. The box was tucked behind winter tires and an old futon frame. Inside were transfer agreements, signature pages, and a printed summary of transactions. All of it connected to the missing funds, all of it bearing some version of my handwriting. My father told investigators that he had noticed me paying unusual attention to my grandfather's financial records in his final months. He said he had expressed concern, but hadn't wanted to start a family argument. He said it with the quiet disappointment of a man who had tried everything he could. I stood in my kitchen while they carried that box out, and I understood, slowly and then all at once, that this had been planned long before my grandfather took his last breath. The weeks between the arrest and the trial moved the way bad dreams do, too fast and too slow at the same time. The story ran in local papers across Grey and Simcoe counties. My employer not to come in. My landlord started leaving notes. My fiancé, Adrian, sat across from me at a coffee shop 3 weeks after my arrest and said he couldn't do it. He had tried to think it through. He didn't want to believe it. But he couldn't build a life alongside a fraud conviction. He slid my ring across the table and didn't wait for me to pick it up. The trial lasted 11 days. My father took the stand first. He described how I had become fixated on my grandfather's estate during his illness, how he had suggested involving a professional trustee, but my grandfather had dismissed the idea. He was measured, credible. He spoke like a man recounting something that had genuinely broken his heart. My brother testified next. He said he had seen my grandfather distressed after one of my visits and hadn't understood why until the investigation revealed what I had been doing. He cried at one point. The jury watched him cry. My mother testified last. Her voice barely rose above a whisper. She said she had always believed the best of me and that this was the hardest thing she had ever done. The Crown attorney let her pause for a long time before asking the next question. Every second of that pause told the jury that her pain was real. The jury deliberated for less than a day. When they returned, the foreperson didn't look at me once while she read the verdict. As the officers led me out, I turned back toward the gallery. My father had already leaned toward my brother and said something I couldn't hear. My brother nodded. My mother was folding a tissue into a precise little square. None of them watched me leave. That image followed me through every season I spent inside. The first year at Vannes had a particular kind of sameness that wore on you in ways that were hard to explain afterward. Every morning started with the same sounds, keys, shoes on concrete, and every evening ended the same way. I was not a disciplinary problem. I was a bookkeeper from Barry who had been convicted of defrauding her dying grandfather's estate. The other women there knew that. Some believed it. Most were too focused on their own situations to spend much energy on mine. What wore me down wasn't the routine. It was the silence from outside. My parents changed their phone number. My brother sent one letter early on that said he hoped I would use the time to reflect. I wrote back twice. He never replied. Friends from my life before, people I had believed were genuinely close to me, found it easier to say nothing than to choose a side. After a few months, I stopped expecting the mail. The career I had spent years building disappeared the way things do when your name becomes a warning instead of a person. No one was going to hire a bookkeeper convicted of financial fraud. My credentials, my references, the reputation I had built file by file, client by client, none of it survived the headlines. The distance from people I had known my whole life came slowly but landed harder than the sentence itself. If you have never experienced it, it is difficult to describe what that kind of sustained judgment does to your certainty about your own memories. I knew I hadn't signed those documents. I knew I hadn't opened a numbered corporation or moved a single dollar of my grandfather's money. I had replayed every afternoon at his kitchen table, every phone call from those last months, every conversation we'd had about what he wanted his estate to look like. But after a year of being told otherwise by a courtroom full of people, some nights I would lie in the dark and feel my certainty begin to loosen at the edges. The person who kept it from slipping away entirely was not a lawyer or an advocate or anyone I would have predicted. Her name was Margot. She and her husband had farmed the property directly north of my grandfather's for over 40 years. She had eaten at his table more times than she could count. She had driven him to his cardiology appointments when the drive had started to feel too long for him to manage alone. She was 71 years old, still sharp, still stubborn, and she had never believed for one moment that I had stolen anything from him. What bothered her wasn't sentiment. Margot was not a sentimental woman. What bothered her was the numbers. She had helped my grandfather with his personal tax filings for years, not professionally, just as a friend who understood accounts, and she knew roughly what his estate looked like. After the trial, she watched my parents hire contractors to renovate the farmhouse. She watched my brother buy a new truck and put a deposit on a condo in Collingwood. She watched money move through their lives, like it had always been there, and she knew it hadn't. She requested a copy of the estate documents through her own lawyer, and spent evenings going through them at her kitchen table. Then, one afternoon, while sorting through a box of old birthday cards she had kept over the years, she found a card my grandfather had sent her 3 months before he died. Inside, in his careful handwriting, he had written something she had assumed at the time was just an old man being cautious. Now it read completely differently. Margot, if anything starts to feel wrong with the farm after I go, don't trust the paperwork alone. Call Blythe first. She drove to Owen Sound that same week and walked into the office of a lawyer who had played no part in my original case. What happened next moved slowly, the way these things always do when they involve overturning something a court has already decided. The lawyer filed a motion requesting access to the original estate records. A forensic accountant was brought in. She spent weeks examining every transaction connected to my grandfather's estate, not just the ones flagged at my trial, but all of them, going back 5 years. The trail she found did not lead to me. The money had moved through a numbered corporation, but not the one registered under my name. A second corporation, registered in my brother's name 18 months before my grandfather's death, had received the initial transfers. From there, funds had been distributed through a web of accounts, some in my father's name, some connected through a property management company my father had been a silent partner in since the 90s. Not $1 had ever passed through any account connected to me. At the same time, the forensic accountant raised a question about the original documents. The signatures on the transfer agreements had been accepted at trial, without independent verification, because the Crown had already presented its own handwriting evidence. The new team requested a second analysis. 2 independent examiners spent 3 weeks on those documents. Their conclusion was the same. The signatures were not mine. They had been produced using a copying technique accurate enough to pass casual review, but showing microscopic inconsistencies under proper examination, inconsistencies that had never been presented to my jury. Then Margot did something no one else had thought to do. She went back to the farm. The property was tied up in estate proceedings and couldn't be sold while the case was being reviewed, so it sat mostly empty. Margot had a key. My grandfather had trusted her completely, and one afternoon she walked through the barn to look at something she had been turning over in her mind for weeks. Years earlier, after a piece of equipment went missing, my grandfather had installed a basic security camera system on the property. The camera unit had long since been replaced, but Margot remembered him mentioning that he kept backup recordings on a card somewhere in the barn office. The office was a small room off the main structure, barely bigger than a closet, with a wooden desk and shelves of old binders. She found it under a loose floorboard beneath the desk. Small lockbox, the kind sold at any hardware store. Inside were 2 things: a handwritten ledger my grandfather had kept privately, separate from his official estate records, and an SD card in a paper sleeve labeled with the year. The footage was date-stamped. Most recordings were unremarkable. Deer crossing the yard at night, my grandfather walking between the barn and the house in the early morning. But there was one recording from a Thursday afternoon, 13 months before my grandfather died. My father's truck was parked in the yard. A man Margot didn't recognize stood beside him. They spread papers across the hood of the truck and stood there for nearly 20 minutes. My brother's car arrived halfway through. The 3 of them reviewed documents together, signed something, and left. My grandfather's private ledger told the rest of the story in his own careful handwriting. He had recorded his concerns 1 entry at a time, dates when he had felt pressured, conversations where my father had introduced the idea of transferring certain assets before probate to save on taxes, a note that he did not want to sign anything without speaking to me first. He had written my name next to that note, with a small circle around it, the way he always marked the things he didn't want to forget. He had known something wasn't right. He just hadn't understood how far along it already was. When the SD card and the ledger were submitted as new evidence, the process accelerated. The Crown Attorney's Office opened an internal review of how evidence had been handled at my original trial. It emerged that the second numbered corporation, the one connected to my brother, had been flagged by a financial analyst early in the original investigation, but had never been disclosed to my defense. Whether that was oversight or something more deliberate, the review stopped short of a clear answer. What it established without question was that my jury had never seen it. The court ordered all accounts connected to my father, my mother, and my brother to be frozen pending a new hearing. My father contacted a private attorney. My brother stopped giving interviews to the local paper, where he had over the years occasionally spoken about what the situation had done to the family. 3 days before the new hearing was scheduled to begin, investigators attempted to reach my father for a follow-up interview. He didn't answer. My mother didn't answer. My brother's phone went straight to voicemail. All 3 of them had driven to Toronto that morning. They had an appointment with a notary to complete the transfer of a piece of property my grandfather had owned in Bruce County. A transaction they had been quietly preparing for months, apparently believing the new evidence would still give them time. They were sitting in the notary's waiting room on the 4th floor when 2 officers from the Ontario Provincial Police walked in through the door. My mother started crying before anyone said a word. The hearing was held on a Tuesday in March. The courtroom was full. I sat beside my lawyer and watched the same room that had taken 5 years from my life work slowly through what it still could give back, my name. The forensic evidence was presented without theatrics. The video from the SD card played without narration because it didn't need any. My grandfather's private ledger was read aloud, and his voice lived in every sentence of it, careful and deliberate the way he had always been. The handwriting analysis was explained in language the court could follow. The financial trail was laid out transaction by transaction until the structure of it was undeniable. When the Crown Attorney attempted to challenge the ledger's authenticity, the handwriting examiner, who had spent 3 weeks on the forged signatures, was asked to compare samples. The comparison took less than 15 minutes to explain. The ledger was genuine. The transfer documents were not. If you're watching this from somewhere in Canada or anywhere else in the world, I'd genuinely love to hear from you in the comments below. Stories like this one mean so much more when I know someone out there is listening. The judge took 2 days to review the complete record. When she returned, she addressed the court briefly and directly. She stated that the conviction had been based on fabricated evidence, and that no credible foundation remained to support the original finding. She declared me fully and completely innocent. I did not cry in that moment. I had used up crying long before that Tuesday in March. What I felt was something quieter, a loosening, the way a held breath finally releases after you have forgotten you were holding it. I squeezed my lawyer's hand once and looked at the back wall of the courtroom for a long time while the room moved around me. The civil proceedings that followed were slower than I had expected. A judgment against my father, my mother, and my brother required the return of all diverted estate funds plus financial compensation for the wrongful conviction. My father's lawyer filed twice to reduce the amount. The court denied both motions. My brother maintained until nearly the end of the hearings that he had not fully understood what he was participating in. The footage from the barn made that argument very difficult to sustain. All 3 of them received federal sentences. My father was sentenced to 7 years. My mother, whose involvement the court judged secondary, though not peripheral, received 3. My brother, who had signed documents, attended meetings, and testified falsely against his own sister, received 5. I was not in the courtroom the morning they were led away. I had said everything I needed to say. I didn't need to watch the ending. The months after my release were disorienting in ways I hadn't prepared for. I had imagined freedom as a clear line, one side inside, one side out, but it didn't work that way. The world had continued without me for 5 years, and stepping back into it felt like arriving late to something where everyone else had already found their seats. I had to relearn small things: how to choose what to eat, how to fill a morning without being told what came next, how to be alone in a quiet apartment without it feeling like punishment. I used a significant portion of the civil settlement to establish a small trust, administered through a legal aid organization in Ontario, to support people facing wrongful conviction in financial fraud cases, people who can't afford the kind of forensic accounting that eventually freed me, people who don't have a Margot in their corner. Setting it up gave me something I hadn't expected to find so quickly. A reason to get up in the morning that had nothing to do with the people who had put me away. Margot herself refused any recognition. She said she hadn't done anything anyone else wouldn't have done with a filing cabinet full of birthday cards and 4 decades of knowing someone worth knowing. I told her that wasn't true, and she changed the subject by asking if I wanted tea. Some people from my previous life reached out after the verdict became public. A few were genuinely remorseful in ways that took time and humility. Others seemed to want the discomfort of what had happened to resolve faster than it reasonably could, as though a phone call and an apology could settle 5 years. I listened to all of them. Forgiveness was something I had decided to work toward. Not for them, not to make anything easier for anyone else, but because I had spent 5 years watching what happens to a person who holds on to anger with nowhere to put it. I didn't want that to be the thing the experience left me with. But I had also learned, in a way that could not be unlearned, that forgiveness and trust were not the same thing. I could release the people who had hurt me without pretending they had not done what they had done. Both things were true at the same time. Both things could stay true. There was one place I had been putting off visiting. A few weeks after the settlement was finalized, I drove back to Grey County on a Sunday morning in late spring. The farm itself was still in legal assessment, and the driveway was grown over with a full season of grass. I parked on the road and walked through the long growth to where the old maple trees ran along the south fence line. My grandfather had walked that line every morning when his knees still allowed it. He said it was the best part of the property because it looked different every single day. I stood there for a while without saying much. I thought about the afternoon I had sat with him at his kitchen table for the last time, both of us going through a binder of property documents while the radio played something old in the background, and how ordinary it had seemed. How completely ordinary. He had trusted me enough to put my name in a circle, in a private notebook he knew someone might one day find. He had prepared for the possibility that something would go wrong. He had done what he could with what he had. The truth had needed more than just him. It had needed a stubborn 71-year-old woman with 40 years of birthday cards. It had needed a lawyer willing to work on faith. It had needed a lockbox under a floorboard in a barn that nobody had thought to search. And it had needed time, far more time than any of us should have had to give. But it had held. Through 5 years and a fraud conviction and a courtroom full of people who chose the easier story, the truth had simply held. I walked back through the long grass to my car, and I didn't look back at the farm. I had already decided that what I was carrying out of that place would not be the story of what was taken. It would be the story of what survived.